Fishing in the winter has always been a test of patience. The frozen lakes, the biting wind, the endless waiting. It's not for everyone, but for me, there's nothing better. That's why, despite the freezing temperatures, I found myself alone on Blackwood Lake last January, drilling holes into the ice. I had been ice fishing for years, but that night, I learned a lesson I'll never forget. Some holes should never be drilled. Blackwood Lake was a quiet place, tucked away deep in the Minnesota wilderness. Not many people came out this far in the dead of winter. That was part of its charm. No competition, no noise, just you, the ice, and the water below. I arrived just before dusk, pulling my sled across the frozen surface, my breath clouding the air. The ice was thick, at least 10 inches, more than safe to walk on. I set up my gear, drilled a hole near the center of the lake, and dropped my line. That was my first mistake. The first couple of hours were uneventful. No bites, no movement, just the quiet creaking of the ice beneath me. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying the occasional snow flurry. Then, just as I was thinking about packing up, my line went taut. I grabbed my rod, my pulse quickening. The weight on the other end was heavy, stronger than anything I'd hooked before. I started to reel it in, the line straining under the pull. Whatever it was big. But then, something strange happened. The ice beneath me groaned. I froze. I had been ice fishing long enough to know the sounds of shifting ice, but this was different. It wasn't a crack. It was a voice. A low, guttural whisper, vibrating through the ice beneath me. I slowly looked down at the hole I had drilled. The water was no longer black. It was red. My stomach dropped. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling. There was no way I was seeing what I thought I was. The ice was solid. The lake was deep. There was nothing beneath me that could bleed. And yet, the water kept darkening, as if something was rising from below. Then, the whisper came again. This time, I understood it. Let go. A sudden, violent tug nearly pulled the rod from my hands. I barely had time to react before the ice beneath me shifted, the cracks spiderwebbing outward from the hole. Panic set in. I reached for my knife and cut the line, letting whatever was below take the bait. For a moment, everything went still, and then a hand emerged. It shot up through the hole, long, pale fingers gripping the edge of the ice. I couldn't breathe. The hand twitched, the fingers stretching, nails cracked and blackened. It was human, but wrong, too long, too thin. The skin stretched too tight over the bones. And then another hand appeared. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the ice. The hands pulled, slowly lifting something out of the water. A face followed. It was gray and bloated, the skin covered in frost, the eyes black and sunken. Its mouth was open, water spilling out as if it had been drowning for years. And then, in a voice that wasn't human, it whispered, "You took my place." I ran. I didn't grab my gear. I didn't even think. I just sprinted for the shore, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I heard scraping, the sound of nails against ice. I didn't look back. I reached my truck, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. For a long time, I just sat there, gasping for air. And then, I heard it, a knock. It was soft, almost polite, like someone asking to come inside. I turned my head, every nerve in my body screaming not to look, but I did. And through the frost-covered window, I saw it, a handprint on the glass, wet, dripping, like something had crawled out of the lake and followed me. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, that the cold, the exhaustion, and the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But when I returned to retrieve my gear, I found something I can't explain. The hole in the ice was still there, and next to it, where I had been sitting, were footprints. But they weren't mine. They led from the hole, not away from it, like something had climbed out. And I know, deep down, that something is still waiting beneath that ice, waiting for the next person to cast their line. Fishing is a game of patience, and I've always been good at waiting. I've spent entire nights sitting by the water, watching the moonlight ripple across the surface, listening to the wind whistling through the trees. But after what happened last winter at Whitewood Lake, I haven't been able to set foot near a body of water since. It started with a lure that I should have never pulled out of the water. Whitewood Lake sat deep in the forests of northern Wisconsin, completely isolated from the world. It wasn't a well-known fishing spot, just a few old rumors passed down about the monster pike that lurked in the deep, stories meant to lure in the kind of fishermen who chased legends. I never believed those stories. Not until that night. I arrived just before sunset, my breath visible in the icy air. Snow had already started to coat the frozen ground, and the lake was half covered with a thin layer of ice. It was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just the occasional groan of ice shifting beneath the surface. I set up near the open water, right at the edge of where the lake had started to freeze. It wasn't the safest spot, but I had fished here before and knew where the ice was strong. I baited my hook, cast my line, and waited. I was expecting the usual slow, steady process. Maybe a bite every half hour, maybe nothing at all. But within seconds, my line jerked hard, nearly yanking the rod out of my hands. My pulse jumped. I hadn't even settled in yet, and I had already hooked something? I tightened my grip and started to reel it in. But the thing on the other end wasn't fighting like a fish. There was no struggle, no thrashing, just dead weight, like I had hooked something lifeless. I frowned, pulling harder, my breath coming in short clouds of mist. The line was heavy, but there was no resistance, just the steady pull of something rising from the dark water below. Then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was a fish, but as it broke the surface, my stomach dropped. It was a lure, a large, antique-looking fishing lure. Its hooks rusted, its paint chipped away by time. The strange part? I hadn't put a lure on my line. My breath hitched. It dangled from the end of my hook, as if something below had attached it to my line on purpose. A chill crawled down my spine. My first thought was that I had somehow snagged an old line, maybe from a fisherman who had lost their tackle years ago. But as I turned the lure in my hands, my blood ran cold. Carved into the metal, barely visible beneath the rust, was a name. My name. I dropped it like it had burned me. The metal clinked against the ice. My mind raced. There was no logical explanation. I had never been here before, never lost a lure, and yet, how was my name on it? A soft ripple broke the surface of the water. Then another. And then, something knocked against the bottom of the ice. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping. The ice let out a low groan, vibrating beneath my feet. I peered into the water, my breath fogging against the frigid air. The lake was dark, impossibly deep, but just as I was about to turn away, something moved. Not a fish, a shape, rising. I couldn't breathe. A face was staring up at me through the ice. It was distorted, barely visible beneath the shifting water, but I could make out hollow black eyes and a wide, gaping mouth. Its lips moved, and then a voice whispered my name. I ran. I didn't think. I just bolted toward my truck, my heart slamming against my ribs. The ice behind me creaked, the whisper growing louder, closer, wrapping around me like an icy fog. I threw my gear into the truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The whispering didn't stop. It was right outside the window. I turned my head, and my stomach dropped. A handprint was smeared against the frost-covered glass, dripping, wet, like something had just climbed out of the lake. I floored the gas, the truck skidding as I tore down the icy road. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Didn't breathe until the lake was a distant memory in my rearview mirror. But even now, even months later, I still have the lure. I try to throw it away. I even burned it. But no matter what I do, I always find it back in my tackle box, waiting. Ice fishing is something I've done my whole life. There's something about the frozen silence of a winter lake, the way the world slows down, that always gave me peace. But last February, on Black Hollow Lake, I learned that some things shouldn't be disturbed. That day, the lake didn't feel right. The air was too still, the snow too perfect, as if the place had been waiting for me. And by the time I realized that I wasn't alone out there, it was already too late. Black Hollow Lake sat deep in the forests of North Dakota, an isolated stretch of water that froze over completely in the winter. The ice was thick, solid enough to drive a truck across, and the fishing was supposed to be incredible. I had driven out early in the morning, hauling my gear across the lake with a sled, eager to find a good spot before the afternoon snow rolled in. But I wasn't the first one there. As I reached the middle of the lake, I noticed an ice fishing hole up ahead. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. The edges had started to refreeze, thin sheets of ice forming over the water. But what bothered me was that there were no footprints leading to it. The surrounding snow was untouched, like the hole had been there forever. I stopped a few feet away, unease creeping into my chest. I knew I hadn't drilled it, and if someone else had, where were they? A gust of wind kicked up, howling through the trees. I shook off the nerves and set up nearby, telling myself I was being paranoid. People fished here all the time. Maybe they had left before the last snowfall. But then I saw something moving beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was a fish, but the shape was wrong. It was long, too long, gliding silently under the surface. And then, as the light shifted, I realized it wasn't under the water. It was just beneath the ice. I stared, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The shape moved slowly, twisting beneath the frozen surface like a shadow that didn't belong. Then, it stopped, right beneath my feet. I held my breath, and then, ever so faintly, I heard a knock. It wasn't the ice cracking. It wasn't my imagination. It was deliberate. A slow, rhythmic knock, like something below was testing the surface. I staggered back, my boots slipping, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, the knocking answered itself. Another knock sounded from behind me, then another, and another. It was coming from everywhere, a chorus of tapping, whispering through the ice, circling me. And when I looked down at my own reflection, there was someone staring back at me. It wasn't me. The face beneath the ice was too pale, the mouth too wide, the eyes. They blinked. I staggered backward, my legs nearly giving out. And then, as if responding to my terror, the ice beneath my feet cracked. I turned and ran. I left everything, my gear, my sled, my rod. I didn't care. I ran for the shore, my breath burning in my chest. The knocking grew faster, louder, until it was pounding like a heartbeat, chasing me across the ice. Then, right behind me, a deafening crack. I risked a glance back. The ice where I had been standing was gone. The hole had widened into a gaping void, the black water swallowing my fishing spot whole. But the worst part? Something was climbing out of it. I didn't wait to see what it was. I sprinted for my truck, my vision blurring with panic. When I reached the shore, I risked one last look at the lake. The hole in the ice was closing, freezing over, as if it had never been there. And in the distance, standing perfectly still on the ice, was a figure, watching me. I don't remember driving home. I don't remember anything except the feeling that I had been hunted. That night, as I sat in my apartment, trying to convince myself it had been hypothermia, exhaustion, paranoia, I heard it again. The knock. From inside my apartment. From inside my bathroom mirror. I haven't been back to Black Hollow Lake. And I never, ever will. Fishing has always been my escape. There's nothing better than the calm of the water, the gentle pull of a fish on the line, the crisp air filling your lungs. But after what happened last winter, I've come to understand something terrifying. Not every lake wants to be fished. I learned that the hard way on Deadwood Lake. Deadwood wasn't on any of the usual fishing maps. It was a hidden lake, tucked deep in the Maine wilderness, surrounded by miles of untouched forest. The only way to reach it was a long, winding dirt road barely wide enough for a single truck. A friend of mine, Elliot, told me about it. Best ice fishing spot I've ever seen, he had said. Huge pike, barely any other fisherman. You'll have the whole place to yourself. That last part should have been my first warning. The drive took longer than expected. The road was worse than I thought. Narrow, twisting, lined with trees that seemed to lean in like they were watching me. When I finally reached the lake, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that makes your skin crawl. There were no birds, no wind, not even the sound of ice creaking, just nothing. I shook off the unease and started setting up. The ice was thick, nearly 12 inches, more than enough to support my weight. I drilled my first hole near the center of the lake and lowered my line, settling into wait. But the moment my hook touched the water, I heard my name. At first, I thought I imagined it. A soft whisper, carried by the wind. I turned, scanning the shore, but I was alone. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the cold. But then, I heard it again, closer. I gritted my teeth, trying to focus on my fishing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then my line jerked hard, nearly pulling my rod from my hands. Adrenaline shot through me as I gripped the reel, fighting against the weight on the other end. It was strong, too strong. But as I started to pull it in, the whispering got louder. And then, the ice beneath me cracked. A web of thin fractures splintered out from my fishing hole. I froze, my breath catching. The ice should have been solid. I had checked, but now it looked fragile. And then, something moved beneath it. Not a fish, something big. I stared into the hole, heart hammering. And then I saw them, eyes, dark, empty, staring up at me from beneath the ice. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to me, it said my name. I scrambled back, my boots slipping. The whispering turned into screaming, a low, distorted wail that vibrated through the ice. Something pushed against the surface, cracking it wider. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my gear. I don't remember running back to my truck. But I do remember looking back as I peeled out onto the frozen road. And there, standing in the middle of the lake, was me, or something that looked like me, watching, smiling. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know what I pulled up from that lake, or if I even pulled up anything at all. But I do know one thing. Deadwood Lake still knows my name. And some nights, when the wind is just right, I can still hear it calling me back. Fishing in the winter has always been something I looked forward to. There's something peaceful about being out on the frozen lake, the crisp air, the solitude. Just me, the ice, and the fish beneath it. But last February, on Black Pine Lake, I realized that not everything under the ice is meant to be disturbed. And some things, watch from below. Black Pine Lake sat deep in the forests of Minnesota, surrounded by thick trees and jagged rock formations. It wasn't a well-known spot, but that's what made it perfect. No tourists, no loud groups, just silence and ice. I had been fishing there for years, but that night, I decided to go a little farther out than usual, closer to the center of the lake. That was my first mistake. By the time I set up my gear, the sun had already started to set. The ice beneath me was thick, almost 14 inches, strong enough to hold a truck. I drilled a hole, dropped my line, and settled into my chair, the cold air biting at my face. The first hour was quiet, just the occasional groan of the ice shifting. But then, I saw something beneath me. It was faint at first, just a dark shape moving under the ice. At first, I thought it was a fish, maybe a huge pike lurking just out of sight. But then, it stopped moving, and just floated there, watching. My breath caught in my throat. The ice was thick, but the water was still clear enough that I could make out details. It wasn't a fish. It was a face. A man's face. Pale. Eyes wide. Mouth slightly open, like he had been screaming before he drowned. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs. There was no way. There hadn't been any reports of a drowning. Not recently, not ever. And yet, there he was, staring up at me. I forced myself to look closer, trying to convince myself that I was seeing things. Maybe it was a trick of the ice, an illusion from the way the water moved. But then, his eyes blinked. I nearly fell backward, my boots slipping against the frozen surface. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. Then, he started moving. His face disappeared, fading into the darkness below. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just sat there, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then, from beneath the ice, I heard it. A knock. I stared down at the fishing hole, my body rigid with fear. Knock, knock. It was slow, deliberate, directly under my feet, like something was trying to get out. I scrambled up, grabbing my gear, my instincts screaming at me to run. But as I turned to leave, the ice creaked, the sound vibrating beneath me. I looked down, and my reflection wasn't mine. The man was looking up at me again, but this time, it was through my own reflection. His face mimicked mine, but it wasn't right. The smile was too wide. The eyes were too dark. And then, he knocked again. The ice cracked beneath my boots. I ran. I didn't care about my gear. I didn't care about the hole in the ice widening behind me. I just ran for my truck, my breath fogging in the freezing air. Behind me, I heard something moving beneath the ice. Something following me. I reached the truck, threw the door open, and jumped inside. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Then, slowly, I looked at my rearview mirror and saw him, standing on the ice. I don't remember the drive home. I don't remember how long it took before I finally stopped shaking. But I do remember one thing. That night, my bathroom mirror cracked, and on the surface was a single, wet handprint. I never went back to Black Pine Lake, but sometimes, in the dead of winter, when everything is quiet, I still hear the knocking, and I know that somewhere, beneath the ice, he's still waiting. Fishing has always been my passion. It's what keeps me sane. Just me, the water, and the quiet isolation of the wilderness. I've fished rivers, oceans, and frozen lakes, but after what happened at Grimshaw Lake, I can't even look at my tackle box without feeling sick. Because sometimes, when you cast your line into the water, something else is waiting to pull you in. Grimshaw Lake sat deep in the wilderness of Alaska, untouched by civilization. It was remote, buried beneath miles of snow-covered pines, a place so silent that the only sound you could hear was the crunch of your own boots. It wasn't on any maps. My uncle, Ron, had taken me there years ago, calling it the best-kept secret for winter fishing. "It's untouched," he had said. "No tourists, no noise, just you and the fish." That should have been my first warning. I arrived in late January, the cold biting deep, the lake frozen solid as stone. The sky was gray, the air heavy with that eerie, pre-snow silence. I pulled my sled across the lake, my boots crunching against the ice. That's when I saw it. A fishing hole, already drilled. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. A thin film of ice had started to form over it, like someone had been here recently. But there were no footprints, no sled tracks, just the hole, as if someone had fished here and then vanished. I hesitated, my breath fogging the air. Then I saw the lure. It was still hanging over the hole, suspended in midair, its thin metal hook glinting in the dim light. I frowned. Who would leave their gear behind? I stepped closer, reaching for it, and then I saw the name carved into it. My name. It was scratched into the metal, barely visible beneath the rust, the letters jagged and uneven. I staggered back, my pulse hammering. This wasn't possible. I had never been here before, and yet, someone had left a lure with my name on it. I turned, ready to leave, when my fishing rod suddenly jerked hard, nearly yanking me off my feet. My breath caught. I had set my line a minute ago, but there was no way something had bitten already. I grabbed the rod, my hands shaking. The line wasn't pulling down. It was pulling sideways, as if something under the ice was dragging it. A low creaking sound rumbled beneath me. The ice. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sick feeling in my gut. Maybe it was just a fish. Maybe the current was stronger than I thought. I reeled it in, and what came out of the hole made my stomach turn. It wasn't a fish. It was a glove, waterlogged, frozen stiff. I dropped it immediately, my pulse roaring in my ears. Then I saw something move beneath the ice. A shadow, long and thin, gliding just below the surface. My breath caught, and then it stopped, directly beneath me. The whispering started, soft at first, like wind slipping through cracks in the ice. Then clearer. A voice. "Pull me up." My whole body went cold. The shadow beneath the ice shifted, and then, a hand slammed against the underside of the ice. I screamed. The hand was human, fingers long and bent the wrong way, the skin pale and frostbitten. It pressed against the frozen surface, the fingers twitching, trying to grip something, trying to grab me. I ran. I left everything, my rod, my sled, the glove. As I sprinted for the shore, I heard it, a knock. I stopped, my breath hitching. Another knock, then another. It wasn't coming from the ice beneath me. It was coming from inside the fishing hole. I ran faster than I ever had before. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my heart slamming against my ribs. I threw myself inside, locking the doors. I expected to see something chasing me, but the lake was still. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Then, just before I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror, and I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the ice, watching me. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know who left that lure, or why my name was on it, but I do know one thing. Something is waiting beneath the ice, and next time, it won't be a lure it pulls up. It'll be me. Ice fishing has always been my way to escape. There's something about the isolation, the silence of the frozen lake, and the slow rhythm of the waiting game that always put my mind at ease. But after what happened last winter on Hollow Birch Lake, I'll never go out on the ice alone again. Because that night, I saw something in the water. Something that looked like me. Hollow Birch Lake sits deep in the forests of Montana, miles away from the nearest town. It's one of those places you don't find on a map, a hidden spot known only to a handful of old fishermen. It had been on my list for years, but every time I planned a trip, something stopped me. Bad weather, broken gear, a last-minute change of plans. This year, though, I wasn't going to let anything stop me. That was my first mistake. I arrived in the late afternoon, the winter sun barely peeking through the thick gray clouds. A fresh layer of snow covered the frozen lake, untouched except for the occasional deer track. I was completely alone. The silence should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt wrong. Like the whole lake was holding its breath. I dragged my sled across the ice, searching for the right spot. The surface was thick, at least 15 inches, more than enough to hold my weight. I found a good spot near the center and drilled my hole, the sound of the auger echoing across the empty lake. As soon as I set up my line, the air changed. It got heavier, like something was watching me. At first, I ignored it. I told myself it was just the isolation, my nerves getting the best of me. But then, I saw the reflection. It was faint, barely visible beneath the ice, but there was no mistaking it. A face. Not mine. Someone else's. I stumbled back, my breath fogging in the frigid air. My first thought was that it was just a trick of the light, my own face distorted in the shifting water. But then, it blinked. My hands turned to ice inside my gloves. The reflection wasn't following my movements. It wasn't me. It was someone else, looking up at me. Their mouth moved, lips parting as if they were trying to speak. Then, ever so faintly, I heard it. A whisper. My own voice. Come closer. I shot to my feet, my boots slipping on the frozen surface. I wanted to run, to grab my gear and get the hell off that lake, but I was frozen in place. Because the reflection, it was crawling out of the hole. The ice beneath me groaned, spiderweb cracks forming around the edges of the fishing hole. The thing in the water reached upward, its fingers stretching, too long, too thin, nails cracked and blackened. And then, it grabbed my ankle. I screamed and kicked at it, my boot smashing against its wrist. The thing jerked but didn't let go. Its grip was ice cold, burning even through my thick pants. It pulled. I fell forward, my hands skidding across the ice as my leg was yanked toward the hole. And then, in my own voice, it whispered again. Come down. The ice is thin here. I thrashed against the grip, my heart slamming against my ribs. And then, a crack. The ice beneath me split open, water bursting up around my legs. For one horrifying second, I saw it clearly. The thing that looked like me. Its face was wrong. Too smooth. Too pale. Its eyes were black and empty. Its mouth stretched into a grin too wide for a human face. And it was still holding me. dragging me down. I don't remember how I broke free. I think I kicked it again, or maybe the ice shifted enough for me to claw my way back. But somehow, I managed to pull myself onto solid ground, gasping for breath, my legs soaked and burning from the cold. I didn't look back. I ran. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the keys. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath fogging the windshield as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw it, standing at the edge of the lake, watching me. It was me, or something wearing my face, and it was smiling. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know what was beneath the ice, or why it looked like me, but I do know one thing. I wasn't supposed to leave, and some nights, when the air is cold and still, I hear the ice creaking outside my house, like something followed me home. Fishing has always been my way to unwind. The peace, the quiet, the thrill of a bite. It's what I live for. But last winter, on Raven's Hollow Lake, I found out that some places aren't meant to be disturbed. It was early December, just after the lake had frozen over enough for ice fishing. I had been coming to this spot for years, setting up my shack a good mile from the shore, far from anyone else. I liked the isolation, but that night, I wasn't alone. The first sign that something was wrong was the footprints. I arrived just before sunset, pulling my sled across the ice, the crisp air biting at my cheeks. I was expecting untouched snow, the way it always was. But instead, I saw tracks leading straight to my fishing shack. Deep, wide impressions, like someone had walked there before me, which was impossible. I was the only one who ever fished this part of the lake. I stopped, staring at the prints. They were fresh, but there were no return tracks. Whoever made them never left. I hesitated before moving closer. The shack looked normal from the outside, just a small wooden structure to block the wind. But something felt off. The door was slightly open. My gut clenched. I was sure I had locked it last time. Slowly, I pushed it open the rest of the way. The inside was empty. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing. No strange footprints in the snow-covered floorboards. Just my overturned chair, as if someone had been sitting in it, and then got up suddenly. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the frigid air. The walls felt too close, the silence too heavy. Then, from outside, I heard crunching footsteps. I spun around, heart hammering. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the falling snow. They were tall, unnaturally so, with a long coat that blended into the night. Their face was hidden beneath a hood, their posture too rigid, too unnatural. They weren't moving, just watching. I swallowed hard. "Hey, you lost?" No response. "Hello?" Nothing. Just the whisper of the wind. And then, they took a step forward. Something in me screamed to run. I lunged for my sled, grabbing my gear and practically throwing myself onto the ice. I ran, my boots slipping, the ice cracking faintly beneath me. I didn't care. I needed to get away. But then, footsteps behind me. Fast. Too fast. I didn't dare look back. I reached the shore, my breath ragged, my vision tunneling. My truck was only yards away now. Then, the sound stopped. Just like that. I turned around. The figure was gone. I scanned the lake, expecting to see footprints leading away. But there were none. Only mine. The tracks that had followed me vanished, like no one had ever been there. I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear into the truck, jumped in, and floored it down the icy road. My heart pounded the whole way home. When I finally calmed down enough to think, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe the snow had covered their tracks. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something outside my window. A single, slow knock. I froze, my blood turning to ice. And then, a second knock. I forced myself to look. And there, just beyond the frost-covered glass, were two deep, dark footprints in the snow.